Welcome to Tokyo Game Life, a Tokyo-based video game podcast focusing on Nintendo and gaming culture in Japan's capital. Your host Mono here to bring you a slice of gaming life from Tokyo. Today, on episode 100, that's right, 100, type designer Kaihatsu joins to chat about Nintendo fonts. We explore the deep world of Japanese type design, why Nintendo keeps using Pop Happiness, the secret NHK connection to the Wii, and a lot more. And in the games, I look at the new Kirby DLC Star-Crossed World and the new face-stretching game Hello Mario. Let's start with the feature on Nintendo fonts with Kaihatsu. Today in the feature, we are talking about Nintendo fonts. Yes, the iconic typefaces, letters, and symbols we see in Nintendo games. How did they make them? What's so amazing about a font? We're going to find out as I'm joined by a special guest. So guest, please introduce yourself.
Hello, I go by Kaihatsu in most places. I do a variety of things, mainly talking about cultural influences in video games on YouTube, but I also talk about typography and fonts in video games. And I like to wrap those two things together by saying I analyze, discuss, and promote creativity through culture.
Thanks for joining me. Today we're talking about Nintendo fonts, a very deep-cut topic, but also a very fascinating one that I think flies under the radar for a lot of people. It's something we've all seen, but we rarely think about. However, I think you think about it quite often. So before we dig into Nintendo, I want to hear about your backstory. How did you become interested in type design?
It's a good question. Goes back quite a while. I mean, when I was younger, obviously, I was always very interested in Nintendo games. And eventually, I started noticing that there seemed to have been a common trend around fonts in Nintendo games, specifically the Western versions of Mario Sunshine and Mario Galaxy. They both use a font called Pop Happiness. I sort of saw that and I was just wondering, why is that? And I got very interested in that particular font. It's still one of my favorites to this day. And I sort of looked into it a bit more. I looked into the company behind it, Fontworks, and realized that they only really conduct business in Japan. And I didn't really think much else of it, but it was always there in the back of my mind. And then when I went to university, because I went to university to study game design, because even when I was younger, I wasn't thinking so much about fonts, but games. I wanted to be a game developer in Japan. So I went to university to study game design. And initially, I started out with cultural influence in games like I did on my YouTube channel. But that slowly branched out into typography for video games because it was an interest that was gradually increasing for me. I think, well, part of it was that my supervisor at university said it was easier to write a thesis on fonts and games than the other things I was interested in. But in 2019, I started a microblog on Twitter called Fontendo. It's Fontendo with a U at the end because Fontendo without the U was taken. But that was just a random thing I started after having an exchange about fonts and games with another Twitter user. And it was just this thing I started as a little side hobby. I thought, well, I'll post a couple times a week about interesting fonts and games. And by the time I finished that microblog, it had over 10,000 followers. So I kept that up while I was at university throughout the pandemic. And when it came to job hunting, I looked at a whole variety of places. I applied to Nintendo with the portfolio of typefaces that I was making at university and a couple other game companies. And then Nintendo didn't take me. I did do an exam at Nintendo, but didn't pass. But I did find another company that was willing to take me on to do a type design role. And part of that was, the things that I'd been involved in through Fontendo, which led me to be curious, not just about, what font is this in a video game, but how do I make a font? Because it was after that I started Fontendo that I wondered to myself, well, I feel like if I talk about fonts so much, I should learn how to make one. Right. So I started making my own fonts, and then I decided to make it official at university by sort of changing the direction of my study. And then I made a portfolio of fonts, and I got hired to be a type designer in Japan. And now it's my job.
Awesome. So it is a really great melding of your two interests, video games and typography. So you really hit the jackpot when it comes to taking the two things you like most and then putting them together and making money off of it.
Yeah, I mean, I do absolutely love my job. They say you never work a day in your life if you do something you're passionate about. And it's something I'm really passionate about. And to be honest, I feel like I like it more than I would like working as, a programmer or a game designer or a planner, which that's what they call them here in Japan. I actually really like just designing fonts. It's a lot more chill. And I know some people that used to work as planners or game designers, and I think it's a much more relaxing role because there's no crunch. There's no you don't really have to deal with all the other things that come with game development itself when you're making fonts. So I think that's one of the nice things about it. And it just seems to be a sort of more niche discipline in the sense that even though type design is a more traditional discipline that's existed longer than game design, I think when it comes to Japan, everyone talks about game development and game design, not so much about font design, really, or type design. And as far as I know, I am the only non-Japanese type designer in Japan that's not indie, so to speak. So that's another exciting thing as well.
Great. Now that we've established you as the absolute expert in the field, let's dig into the main topic, which is Nintendo fonts. Nintendo, of course, has a lot of iconic logos and lettering in their games. I mean, just look at something like the Pokemon logo, look at the Super Mario logo. These are things everybody recognizes. So does Nintendo make their own fonts, or do they use existing fonts?
For the most part, Nintendo has always outsourced that, as most other companies do, because it takes a long time to do a font. And specifically for CJK typefaces, so Chinese, Japanese, Korean, because you need to have kanji to express yourself in the language, you need to make quite a lot of kanji, and that can take a long time. And Japanese, obun, Western letters, Latin, you could probably knock one out in a couple months if you're good. But Japanese typefaces, wabun, so hiragana, katakana, kanji specifically, you're talking 3 to 4 years, almost as long to make a game. To make a Japanese font. So for that reason, you outsource it because it's a lot of time, it's a lot of money, and it takes a lot of finesse to do things like kerning and metrics and all these other things. It's just something that a lot of game companies probably don't want to deal with. And there's already a great library of typefaces out there to choose from.
Yeah, it is interesting that, a lot of the fonts Nintendo uses in their games that sells tens of millions of copies, they just bought that from somewhere else. Other people can use it, and they have been using it. Now, when this happens, do you have an eye for it? Can you just see a font and immediately know, that's the Rodin font? I'm basically asking, do you have font superpowers?
That's an interesting thing. I mean, when it comes to Fontendo, people used to ask me, how do you figure out fonts? And there was sometimes a person, a Captain Byte on the Blue Sky, who was much more technical and would help with data mining later on in the project's lifespan. But, essentially, I would just eyeball it all the time. So there were some times I messed up, but for the most part, I think it's quite easy to distinguish a lot of the fonts that Nintendo uses specifically, because they use, for example, Rodin, even though it's a Gothic typeface and a lot of those look very similar, it's got this characteristic lowercase e where the bar is slanted. It looks very playful. It's a little bit like the E in the Google logo, which I think adds an element of playfulness to a lot of the interfaces that they have by using that typeface. But yeah, more of the Pop Happiness, which I mentioned before, which is in Mario Galaxy and Mario Sunshine and, the English versions of those games. That's a design type. It's a design typeface. So it's very poppy. It's very sort of fun and casual, and you can see it stands out. These kind of typefaces are much easier to distinguish than, things like Rodin, perhaps.
What goes into picking a font for a game? Do they try to prioritize readability, or what's the typical thought process when it comes to determining which font to use?
I think recently readability and UD fonts, have become more popular for the reason that they're more accessible. But I think, a big part of it is character and conveying feeling through a font. You kind of want to have a balance of both, but you obviously want to make sure it's readable. But you also want to make sure that it fits the vibe. I can't remember, it was maybe a couple years ago now, Adobe did this little thing talking about the way different typefaces, I think it was Adobe, it could have been Monotype, one of the two. They talked about how fonts can convey emotions and personality. Like, for example, if you go to a bank, you expect the bank to have a very neutral typeface, or perhaps something that's, a serif typeface, like Times New Roman, for example, is a serif typeface. Something that's strong and dependable and it looks trustworthy. Probably wouldn't want to go to a bank that uses Pop Happiness as its font.
Right.
But yeah, in that same line, for something like Mario that's very bouncy and fun, something like Pop Happiness works very well. Although in Japanese, I think they used Stick, which is also by Fontworks, which is a bit more straight lines, not as many curves as Pop Happiness, but still very fun font. But yeah, I think recently, I've seen a lot of people complain that recently Nintendo's interfaces have become a little bit boring, a little bit devoid of this personality. And I think that is because they dropped Rodin after the Wii U in favor of Yudi Shingo, which is by Morisawa. And that one is slightly different from the retail counterparts in that it was a customized version of it. So Nintendo obviously worked with Morisawa on that. The same way that they've collaborated in the past with Fontworks to make slight tweaks to typefaces to make them more suitable to games or just for whatever they need.
Yeah, I think it would be easy just to use the same font for the same series, but even within the single series, there are a lot of changes. And one thing your Fontendo account pointed out that was really interesting is that the UI font for Super Mario 3D World is actually different between the Wii U and the Switch versions. So what would cause Nintendo to do something like change it to something completely new in the same game?
That's a good question. I think in the case of that game, it was probably to do with readability. I think the newer font is probably easier on the eyes a little bit. I think it's easier for people to read. They've just had this trend recently of using more neutral typefaces. I mean, even Rodin, people think of Rodin already as a very neutral typeface, but it still has this little bit of something else in it. And UD fonts are generally very sort of neutral. They're tailored for being easy on the eyes. Usually when they're created, a lot of research goes into what works best with regular eyesight and people that may have disabilities or other issues with reading. So I think that was probably the main reason for that change there. It could also be to do with licensing or other such things. There's a lot that it could be, but in my opinion, probably to do with legibility.
Now, since English and Japanese have two very different alphabets, is there typically a lot of variation between the fonts used in the same game? Is the UI font in a Mario game, is it the same font across both languages, or do they sometimes need to utilize completely different fonts for a particular language?
The font in Galaxy, for example, is different between the English and Japanese version. So in English, it's Pop Happiness, and in Japanese, I think it's a font called Stick by Fontworks. And it's quite interesting because in the West, you see people online heavily associate Pop Happiness with Luigi's Mansion and Mario Sunshine and Mario Galaxy,
right?
That era of games. Whereas in Japan, that doesn't exist because the font's completely different. And yeah, there could be readability reasons for that. It could be to do with what the localization team thinks works better. But the other thing to point out is actually, in Mario Galaxy, there's two fonts used in the Japanese version. Stick for the kana, and I think it's actually just regular Rodin, or perhaps new Rodin, for the kanji. Because obviously, being a game that will have younger players, I think they wanted something more neutral for the more complicated characters, so that it would be easier for people to read. So for that reason, they combined two different fonts together. And that's actually something that's quite common in Japan, is combining a font that maybe only contains hiragana, katakana, and Latin letters with another font that contains kanji because it saves on development time. So, for example, the font used in Animal Crossing New Horizons is Rodan Wanpaku by Fontworks. And that's actually, the name is a clue as to what it is. It's a combination of two different typefaces. You have Rodan and you have Wanpaku, which is why when you look at it in the game, you compare the Japanese and the English versions of the game, you can see differences in the font, and you can see differences in certain aspects in the English one as well. But that's just because some of the letters have been replaced. And that happens with a lot of different fonts. Rodin has been put into all sorts of different combinations with other fonts, and that's it just expands the fonts that are on offer from a company. Rodin already has a complete set of kanji, but in a lot of cases, what companies do when they're developing a font is they might take kanji from one font and then just put that in, and then that saves time, a huge amount of time. And you can still imbue a lot of character into a font regardless, even if it is a combination. And that sort of, I think maybe in the West, that sort of combining of different fonts, you might think is a little incongruous, I think, for a lot of people. But in Japan, that's a completely normal thing that happens, and people don't bat an eye.
Yeah, it must be a difficult balance to strike. Anytime I play an 8-bit or 16-bit game in Japanese, the pixelated kanji, it just looks like a blob a lot of the time, and you need to use context clues to figure it out. But so one of the joys of HD is that we can easily read fonts with 12 plus strokes in it. But I suppose it's not purely just readability. Are there other elements about a font that connects more with Japanese people compared to those who speak English?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I mean, certainly the way that Japanese people understand Latin script is different from people that are native speakers of English. You can see that in some of the writing quirks that Japanese people have, the way they write the number 7, perhaps, or things like that might be a little bit strange. Like, I know some of my colleagues think it's a bit strange that I put a horizontal bar through my 7, which is something that people in Japan don't really do.
Right.
Whereas the way people write 7 here, they put that little sort of vertical line on the end of the horizontal. It almost makes it look like a katakana ku, if you write it a bit strange. So there's things like that to consider. And I think I've noticed a lot of things as a designer here that maybe my Japanese colleagues wouldn't pick up on, and vice versa. Obviously, they have a lot to say about when I do kanji because, I haven't had the 20 plus years experience of being immersed in that language. But at the same time, it's the sort of reverse for them. They've had exposure to English and Latin script, but it's different. I think one of the biggest differences is that you might notice in a lot of Japanese fonts that, well, for one thing, the spacing sometimes is a little bit strange. And that's because kanji and kana, you're used to this sort of more square appearance. So when they tend to space fonts, I think Japanese designers and people tend to space looser. And it might look a little bit strange to someone that's used to more tight spacing in English. The other thing that's also as a result of that, and the way you design kanji and kana in this little square when you're designing, you're thinking of them more as this sort of square form, is that the ascenders and descenders on letters like P and D tend to be very short in Japanese fonts. And that's, I think, a result of Japanese being less vertical in the sense that Latin script has more vertical lines than kanji do. Japanese is much more horizontally spread in regards to strokes. And so Japanese designers tend to sort of squish down the ascenders and descenders for that reason. And also because they think it fits in better with kana and kanji when you line them up in a sentence. That's also the same reason that a lot of fonts in Japan don't space Greek or Cyrillic letters if they have them. Usually they're monospaced, which means that if you use a font like that from a Japanese type foundry on Wikipedia, for example, in Russian, it becomes almost illegible because everything is spread out way too far because everything is monospaced and is not current. And that's just because they put such things in, well, for basic compatibility, but also because people in Japan don't really use them for writing those languages. They use them to make kaomoji, little faces. People use the Cyrillic D to make like a wide open mouth, for
Right.
those little funny faces you see on places like Nico Dolga or Twitter. So they don't space them because they're not thinking about the language. They're not thinking about Russian or Greek. They're thinking about how does this fit in with Japanese text. They want to assimilate it into Wabun text. That's the main priority. Sort of English is still sort of secondary, even though it's increasingly appearing in Japan. And, Latin script's been used for quite a while now in Japan.
Okay, now I really want to dig into some specific fonts and UI and typeface design philosophy for particular games and systems. One you've spoken about that I thought was very interesting is the Wii. Can you dig into the Wii's UI and font choice and how it has a very Japanese flavor to it?
Yeah, of course. Actually, probably the Wii has my favorite interface of all time. It's beautiful, honestly. Like, I don't really have any other way to describe it. But essentially, it was designed to be this sort of intuitive television-like interface. You have all the sort of CRT screens that are spread across. It feels very 2000s. But of course, the main things that stand out to me are, of course, the fonts and the digital clock, which is also related to lettering, of course. Now, the thing with the digital clock, which initially wasn't on the Wii, but was added later, is because that was on NHK and, other Japanese, teleops, these captions used by Japanese broadcasts. They have that digital clock, and you see it on the Weather Channel, on the Wii, and you see it in all sorts of, other channels, news channels in Japan. They always have that little clock. If you ever turn on the TV in the morning and you watch the news, they'll have the little clock. So they added the little digital clock as a sort of link to make it more familiar to Japanese users, to sort of blend that interface and make it a part of the television, because they kind of wanted the Wii to be a part of the TV almost. And yes, of course, Rodin, again, very, very popular for teleops and titles on television in Japan. So that was the other element of that, really, in the familiarity of the typeface. So not only do you have that playful E, but you have this font which, some people have called Rodin Japan's Helvetica. New Rodin is also used a lot on the Wii. But because these fonts are so ubiquitous and they're so used on television, that those are also automatically quite familiar to Japanese users and players. Actually, Rodin NTLG, that's what it is. New Type Labo Gothic, which, again, is another font that was combined with... So you have Rodin and NTLG, which is from New Type Labo, which is another foundry. So, yeah, it was... I think the thing with the Wii is it's all about that familiarity to Japanese people. Obviously, Nintendo's a Japanese company, but they were kind of focused on making a device that was not only intuitive, but just familiar in just this sort of more deep sense. But despite it being a sort of based on Japanese television, it sort of transcended borders to become this thing that was familiar to so many people. If you, aside from the fonts, people talk about the Wii channel music and all these things combine, and you keep... I see comments even now, people talking about how familiar it feels to them. So it's quite interesting to me that even though it was designed with sort of Japanese television watchers, users in mind, that audience in mind, it sort of went beyond that and spread all over the world and became this sort of familiar thing to so many people.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting to see such a strong connection between NHK and Nintendo in terms of what they want to convey with their fonts. NHK, of course, is the national public broadcast channel in Japan. It's something that everybody in Japan knows about. It really is an integral part of Japanese culture and pop culture. And you could say Nintendo also tried to position themselves as a national symbol of culture by using the same fonts and UI as NHK. And you also mentioned on social media that Switch uses the same font NHK uses now. So that kind of furthers that connection as well. And the connection between the Wii and also the functionality of a TV, it is pretty amazing that the font choice can really convey that subconscious connection.
Yeah, and actually you also saw Rodin on the PlayStation as well around about the same time. So it's become this very familiar font in Japan. But obviously when you talk to people that live outside of Japan, they probably think of video games because that's where their exposure to this has been, which is quite interesting. When I talk with other Japanese designers about things like a New Rodin or a Shin Gothic, which is this very, very Japanese design that's been around since the 70s. It's quite familiar to Japanese people, and some people call it Japan's Helvetica. But when you go outside of Japan, people think of it as, oh, it's the Wii font, or it's this video game font, or whatever. And then when I talk to other designers here about what people outside of Japan think about it, they're very surprised that it's become so recognizable as this piece of Japanese visual culture. Because I suppose to them, at a certain point, you become, font blind, to use that term. And yeah, I think there's still a lot of designers aren't super aware of how Japanese fonts are viewed outside of Japan. But that's definitely something that I'm trying to push on in order to sort of broaden that perspective within Japan.
Now, the next typeface I want to get into, I would say it's maybe my favorite one out of all Nintendo franchises, and that is Splatoon. Can you tell us how the Splatoon typeface came about?
Oh, the Splatoon. Yeah, that's a wonderful story. A couple years ago, I made a video on that very subject. First and, so far only Fontendo video, but there is another one coming. But yeah, I really like that story because I think that's kind of one of the first times we've had this look into Nintendo's process when it comes to type design. And initially in the video I talked about it, there was a write-up on a Japanese website called Career Hack, but that was a transcription of a seminar which some of the UI designers from Nintendo gave about Splatoon's font design. There were other things in it, but one of the aspects was Splatoon's type design, and then Nintendo later wrote up a little thing about it on their careers portal. But they were looking for something unique to go into this game that they were making. They couldn't really find anything that matched what they were looking for. So at the time, designer Mariko Tachibana, who still works for Nintendo, she was the design lead on Mario Kart World, UI design lead on Mario Kart World. She was also working on Splatoon. She went to Seita Inoue, who I believe was the art director on Splatoon, and was talking to him about, type design. And they decided, they couldn't find a font, so they were going to make one. So she got a bit of graph paper out and drew up some basic designs for the Latin script and for the kana. And then I think probably what happened is they went with that to Fontworks, and they collaborated with Fontworks in producing that. I don't know They didn't really go into the specifics of who did what. It's quite possible that the letters and kana were done in-house by Nintendo, and then what happened is they sent that over to Fontworks for, kerning, metrics, cleaning up, tidying up, and then adding in the kanji, because the kanji came from a Fontworks font called Rodi, just spelt rowdy in English, but apparently it's pronounced Rodi in Japanese. But it's very similar to the point that when you put the kanji in with the rest of the letters of the Splatoon font, I should say, you won't really notice any difference. They're very, very similar. They have that sort of dynamic push to the right, very strong, very bold, very powerful, perfect for Splatoon. It's that kind of vibe of this sort of messy, sort of urban settings, and you're battling it out with paint. It's that very sort of powerful feel, powerful but fun. Actually, they cited as an inspiration things like branding on sports water bottles, fitness equipment, clothing. It's that powerful vibe. That's what they were going for. And actually, the interesting thing about Rodi is that it's just Rodin, but modified again. So they took the letters from Rodin and they just pushed the weight of the characters to the right. And just by doing that, it completely changes the look of the font and the feel of the font. It's quite interesting how, even though it is quite a simple thing to do, just shifting the sort of the weight and the density to the right, they came up with this entirely new design. But yeah, they did that for Splatoon 1. That was a great success. And then when they moved on to Splatoon 2, they did it again because, to paraphrase what Marco Tachibana said, the data information density in the interface changed. So it was necessary for them to come up with a new font to complement the one that they already made, because the one they already made is quite thick. And the one that you can see appear in Splatoon 2 and then Splatoon 3 is much thinner. And I believe it's Fontworks' Kurokane that they use alongside their own proprietary font, again for the Latin and kana, along with the kanji from one of Fontworks' fonts, I think, like I said, Kurokane. But they put those together, and then again, they did the same thing. They sort of created something new that sort of imbued the vibe that they were going for, the sort of cool, fresh vibe. That's where the Shinsen fresh.
Yeah, once kanji comes into play, it is hard to just create an entirely new font from scratch. But it is cool to see that it's been adapted to this customized Splatoon font. So there still is a subtle hint of uniqueness to it, even though it was originally made for something totally different. Now, the next game I want to get into, the newly released Mario Kart World. What can you tell us about Mario Kart World's font and its inspirations?
Right, well, this is another thing which I covered very recently in a YouTube short, but I found this very interesting when Mario Kart World was announced. Honestly, I didn't expect them to do this for Mario Kart World. I just assumed that they would do the same thing they did with other Mario Kart series, and that's use Rodin or something. They still sort of do use Rodin, but I'll get onto that. When you're looking in English, you see this sort of powerful brush font, and the first thing that came to my mind is obviously the sort of brush fonts are very powerful, and they have that sort of flickered. The terminals have that sort of flickered brush look to them, which is quite dynamic. And, for a racing game, it indicates speed. This sort of very powerful speed. But also, it makes me think of the sort of brush sign painting that you would have in sort of mid-century. And it made me think a lot of mid-century America. I mean, there's a lot of that in the game. When you start the game up for the first time, you have Mario driving in the sort of desert somewhere in America. I'm not terribly familiar, but the sort of mesas and that kind of thing. I called it the Radiator Springs vibe because it reminded me of Cars, because they both have that same sort of mid-century racing aesthetic, and that's what Mario Kart World was going for with that, and also with the music and other things. And that carried over to the Latin and also the kana in Japanese. But for the kanji, again, I believe it was Rodin that they used because it's easy to read, and because if you were going to create a brush typeface for kanji, you would be here for like 5 years trying to do all of that. And it's interesting to me that they picked a sort of Western style for the brush lettering, because Japan does have its own style of sort of powerful brush lettering called higemoji, like mustache letters, because they named it so because of the little sort of whiskers that came off the end of the brush strokes. That's been around since the Edo period, but that was used in things like Legends Arceus because it's sort of powerful but traditional. Makes people think of sort of the past and, period dramas and that kind of thing. But it wouldn't really work for this setting because it's not like a sort of modern sort of typeface in the way that you would look at a sort of another brush typeface, like the one that's used in Mario Kart World. So you have that sort of mid-century racing influence, but the other thing is it's a kind of font that you would see on mid-century sort of signs, but also Pulp Fiction covers. often use these kinds of sort of brush lettering, very common. I used one example in the short I uploaded, but it was like a sort of murder mystery sort of novel, and it had this sort of brush font. I likened it to Comicraft, which is very, very similar, to the point where some people were actually saying on Twitter that, oh, no, they're using Comicraft's Monster Mash. But it's not. But it is very similar. It's that sort of vibe you see, horror movies, Pulp Fiction covers, because you can sort of use it to not just display that sort of dynamic, sort of speedy racing feeling, but also that sort of horrifying, aggressive horror feeling as well. But obviously in Mario Kart's case, it was supposed to be the sort of fast racing aesthetic.
The font, I think, definitely gives a feeling of Route 66. It has a very Americana vibe to it. And it is kind of amazing that the font can go a long way in kind of conveying the inspiration and atmosphere of the game. Now, the last game I want to get into, it might be a bit hard because as of this recording, it's not out yet, but it is out now for the listeners, and that is Donkey Kong Bonanza. Is there anything interesting about the Bonanza UI and typeface that you've picked up on?
The Donkey Kong Bonanza font is quite interesting to me because it's the same one that was used in, what is it? Oh, Luigi's Mansion. That's right. Every Luigi's Mansion game except for the first one uses AdLib regular, which the initial typeface was released in 1961. But it's this sort of chunky, again, it does have a playful look to it, but it's a more chunky typeface. And I think you can compare that to things like Pop Happiness, which is very springy and bouncy for Mario. And you have Donkey Kong, who is more chunky, is sort of more of a tank. And they have this sort of chunkier typeface to go along with it. And it's a little bit irregular and uneven, which I think that sort of suits Donkey Kong quite well. It's got this sort of bit of a jumbled vibe to it. But it was used in the sequels to Luigi's Mansion, and interestingly, the original typeface, AdLib, after it was released in 1961, 10 years later, it was used in Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. For some of the Oompa Loompa songs, they used the typeface for the lyrics on screen.
Oh, wow.
Because it has that sort of chunky chocolate vibe as well. It's that chunkiness. I think that's the key part of it, is that sort of thick chunkiness that the letter forms have.
So yeah, maybe Chunky Kong is in the game. Maybe this is a subtle hint that Chunky Kong is the game. By the time this episode comes out, people will know whether or not Chunky Kong is in the game. So if he is in the game, we called it.
Prophetic, maybe.
Yeah, from the font. So what do you want people to think about once they see fonts in a video game? Do you want them to kind of sit down and really look at it, or is that kind of not the point of a font at all? It should be like subtle and kind of invisible.
I think, well, I mean, if you think about recent Nintendo games, I think what they want is for people to not notice. I think they want people to have something that's so easy to look at that it just it's so easy to absorb information from that you don't think about it. Because, yeah, when you're reading information, like if you're reading a book or something, you don't really want to think about what font you're looking at, because that's going to distract from taking in information. But of course, when it comes to things like video games, there's a bit of leeway because you've got to install a bit of character and funness in it. Pop Happiness is always the example I go back to, but yeah, or even with AdLib. AdLib, I think, is a reasonably readable font. I would compare it to the first Splatoon font. It's with that sort of thick body, but it's still understandable. It's not so crazy that it's going to impede someone's experience. I think it's all about finding that balance. And obviously, when it comes to games are so varied and diverse that every single game is going to have different needs, from what it needs to take out of a font, whether that's something bouncy and fun and still has this bit of character. And you might notice a little bit and be like, oh, that's sort of fun, and it blends in with the game's story and the game world, the sort of vibe it's going for, or whether that's something more neutral, helps you focus on taking in information from the game, or something that's more widely accessible. I think when it comes to big budget games, they are trending a lot more towards things that are simple to implement. And, most times things are still being outsourced, but obviously with things like the OS font on the Switch, you are going to have companies cooperating with type foundries to make something a little bit custom, or in the case of the Switch's font, it was just changing the shape of a G from a double story to a single G, because double story Gs can look a little bit tricky to read. Single story G is much more familiar to people. But I think maybe in the indie space, there's more opportunity to do strange things with letters and fonts and to play with letters. I think it was either last year at Bit Summit or the year before, I came across this very interesting game, which I cannot remember the name of, sadly, but it was a game that was entirely made out of letters, like kanji. So the entire interface, it looked a little bit like a command prompt window. It was black and white, and they used kanji for like little person kanji for the villagers. And I think that's sort of this interesting way of playing with letters that you wouldn't see in a really big game. So I think maybe in the indie space, we might see more interesting things happening with fonts. But really, for players, just sort of, well, I really enjoy looking at fonts in games and figuring, what font is being used. And I know that most people aren't going to do that because it's a little bit strange, perhaps. But if people want to take more of an interest in fonts in games, I think it's good because I think it would promote more understanding about type design in general and might inspire more people to look at fonts or maybe become designers. There probably are plenty of designers out there who have been inspired by looking at fonts in games. So maybe the next time you boot up a game, have a look, see if you can recognize it, and just think about maybe why is it there? What is it that font brings to the experience, you think?
All right, so that was our look at Nintendo fonts and what goes into picking or making them. So hopefully, listeners, you are now more font conscious from now on, though I am a bit worried maybe we ruined everyone's brains and they'll see kind of into the matrix a little bit. But that's also kind of fun to peel back the layers a bit more and try to think about what the fonts are trying to convey. But anyways, Kaihatsu, where can people find you?
Well, they can find me on Blue Sky under kaihat.su. They can find me on Twitter at KaihatsuYT. They can find me on YouTube at youtube.com/Kaihatsu. And yeah, I think that's it. This website that I just made, even though Fontendo on Twitter, which is at Fontendo with a U, is now done, I have this new website that I've just launched called fonten.do, and that's an archive of all of the tweets and content that Fontendo has put out when it was active. And there's a little search function, so if you want to search for a game, if you want to know what font is used in a game, you can either type in the name of a typeface or the name of a game, and it will come up, and you can read about that font, when it was made, who made it, links to buy it, download it, all that kind of thing.
Great, and the links to everything are in the podcast description, so listeners, check it out. Kaihatsu, once again, thanks for joining me.
Thank you very much for having me.
Like I said in the intro, this is actually episode 100 of Tokyo Game Life. And I can't think of a better wombo combo than talking about two of my favorite franchises, Kirby and Mario, albeit very weird entries in both series. Let's start with Kirby and the Forgotten Land, Nintendo Switch 2 Edition Star-Crossed World. Normally, I am a stickler for putting the full correct title in the podcast title, but I'm just going to call it Kirby Star-Crossed World. Please forgive me if you can. This is the new content from HAL Laboratories' big 3D Kirby adventure, and it's been 3.5 years before we got DLC for it. Is this the longest gap between a game and a DLC release ever? I guess something like Bowser's Fury would count, but you had to buy the whole game again. Here you can just pay $20 for the upgrade pass. And admittedly, it was not something I was really looking forward to, despite being a big fan of the original game. Play more levels of this 3-year-old Kirby game is not super exciting on paper. But once you start to get your hands on it, you think, okay, I remember how good this game is, and it starts to click. It's the latest entry in the Nintendo Switch 2 Edition series of games, which have all oddly been very different from each other. The Zeldas were just a pure resolution and frame rate upgrade with no new in-game content. Mario Party had all the new and upgrade material sequestered off in its own mode, but Kirby is both DLC content with new levels that are integrated into the main game, but also the resolution and frame rate update applies to the entire game as well. So you could think of it as $10 for the resolution and frame rate bump, and $10 for the DLC content, or $20 for the DLC and the frame upgrade is free, or the frame rate upgrade is $20 and the DLC is free, so you can kind of decide how you want to justify it. The Star-Crossed World portion of the game consists of 12 new stages that are sort of remixed versions of existing levels, but very quickly they do start to feel brand new despite being set in the same areas as the levels in the base game. The game starts, a meteor has crashed, and you gotta save a cute new mob called the Starries in order to restore the heart of the meteor and eventually save the day. Light as possible on the story, but I'm sure there is an incredible amount of deep lore here. Kirby lore is far deeper than most assume, but even as a big Kirby fan, it is something I kind of just read up on after the fact. It's like Googling what happened in Elden Ring. The levels spawn next to the existing levels, and they are set in that same level as well. Think of it like an alternative version of that level. One of the core gameplay gimmicks is that there are these diamonds that you hit, and these reveal these blue crystal-esque sections of the stage that you can then platform across. So there's a big gap, you hit a diamond, boom, a bunch of platforms appear. But there are also many hidden ones that reveal secrets. And like the base game, these levels are incredibly dense with these secrets. The mission structure is back where you save the stories instead of the Waddle Dees, and you can clear hidden challenges to find more. I really love this idea in the main game since it encouraged exploration on multiple run-throughs of a level, but some of the missions are a little obnoxious. Oh, you didn't sit on the bench at the mall? Well, you gotta play the level again. At first I assumed this mechanic of making crystal platforms appear in the existing levels was the gimmick of the DLC, and it is for the first stage, but the latter stages do feel far more unique and different from their main game counterpart. They aren't just existing levels with a bunch of new crystal platforms shoved in there. They are completely new and offer challenges for Kirby that take advantage of the new abilities. No new copy powers, but there are 3 new mouthful mode items: Spring, Gear, and Sign. Now, these all sound incredibly boring on paper, but trust me, they are all really fun to engage with. Spring is what you would think: you constantly jump and you can launch yourself higher, but it also has kind of a ground pound move that lets you destroy things. And it is way, way easier to control than Spring Mario. The gear is probably my favorite new one as it lets you climb on walls. It makes this very catchy ticking sound, and I like the little gear imprints on the wall when you move around. And the gear also lets you do some horizontal platforming where you can dash, jump, and then you need to hit B again to latch onto a wall. So the timing between dashing, jumping, and then latching on is really fun to engage with and offers some more unique platforming segments that you wouldn't find in the base adventure. The sign power basically just takes you to a downhill racing segment. There's a couple, and they're all pretty fun since you can attack as a sign, and you can also alter the course by hitting the crystal diamonds. So while the powers are not as wacky as Car Kirby or Vending Machine Kirby, they do offer some brand new types of gameplay that are only in the DLC. But yes, the old favorites do return as well. There is a Car Kirby section, so don't worry. The DLC certainly does enough to make it feel different from the main game. The crystal aesthetic is a nice touch, and the new additions of making crystal platforms and the mouthful mode powers do offer new experiences that are not in the main game. And that's basically what you want from this type of DLC, not just more levels, but reframing the platforming of the game in some interesting way. You want to think, whoa, I couldn't do that in the main game, and this will make you think that. And the frame rate upgrade alone really helps me appreciate the game even more. Kirby feels so buttery smooth to control. A big pink ball of butter, that's who you're playing as. I did think, man, this game just feels good to control and move around in. It does make me want to go back to the older levels with this new frame rate bump and try to explore and clear out some of the secrets, which I have been doing. Like with Zelda, it does offer a good incentive to jump back into the game you thought you were done with. And it's a Kirby game, so of course, great music, and while most of the boss fights are just remixes, the final boss is excellent. A lot of the bosses in Forgotten Land are really just kid-friendly Elden Ring bosses, if you think about it. Now, I wouldn't say this is a criticism per se, but be aware that this DLC is pretty short. I think I rolled credits in maybe 3.5 hours. Now, if you want to 100% the missions and do the new arena challenge, the DLC will probably clock out around 5 to 7 hours. I think a typical playthrough of Forgotten Land with a mix of side stuff is around 15 hours. So if that's $60, you're paying a third of that, so you would expect 5 hours of gameplay, which the DLC certainly has. So the dollar to hour ratio, it does make sense, I suppose. But I can see a lot of people getting this, doing the levels in 1 or 2 sittings and thinking, oh well, I'm done. The director of the DLC is Shinya Kumazaki, who has directed many Kirby titles, including The Forgotten Land, so this is not something that just some smaller team did. It kind of makes me wonder, is he working on a new Kirby game right now? Is someone else going to direct the follow-up to Forgotten Land? Is this DLC just pushing back that game? One of my concerns about the Switch 2 editions of games is that, hey, make new games instead of DLC for old games. But like Furukawa said, game development times are getting longer and longer, and this type of small release might become more frequent, which is fine as long as they don't have any major impact on the production of the next entry. Switch really relied on Wii U ports to keep the software flowing, and Nintendo really can't go to that well anymore. So DLC for Switch 1 games might be this console's version of the Wii U port. I don't know how appealing that is though, especially with these large gaps between the base game and the DLC. Like, imagine next year if they announced new DLC campaigns for Fire Emblem Engage and Pikmin 4. I wouldn't be excited, but once I started playing them, the pieces would fall into place and I would have a good time. And that's basically what happened with Star-Crossed World. All the new levels are fun, the new powers are different, and all in all I had a good time, plus the frame rate upgrade is a huge boon to the base game, which was already excellent. I think if you had a lot of fun with Forgotten Land, it's worth checking out the new content even if the game has completely fallen out of your brain. You will start to remember, oh yeah, this game rules. But if you're on the fence and 4 more hours of Kirby doesn't cut it, then you can use that money for Silksong or something. But you know what game is free? Hello Mario, a new smartphone and Switch game that's part of the My Mario campaign focusing on toddlers. I thought the app was a worldwide release, but apparently only Japan has it now, despite the app supporting many languages. But don't worry, I'm here to tell you all about it. Every detail, every facial expression, the game basically consists of you stretching Mario's face. That's it. But despite this simple concept, there is indeed a lot of hidden things, and the game is full of whimsy. Unlike in Mario 64, you don't have a 3D model of Mario's face, but instead the 2D Nakaue-style art. And shockingly, it is more responsive than the N64. Technology has really come a long way. It supports multiple touch points, so you can stretch out both sides of Mario's face, or bring his left ear up and his right ear down. There's a lot of special scenes, like being able to remove Mario's hat, or changing the style of his mustache, including a Wario-style one. I don't know if there's a specific way to initiate hatless mode, for example. It just seems to happen kind of randomly. And sometimes sunglasses will come down. Sometimes he plays peekaboo. Why? Who knows or who cares? You're just here to stretch Mario's face. There is a menu where you can also pick things and then you can put it into the scene. Like a mushroom will make Mario bigger, and the Cheep Cheep will hit Mario and make him shrink. You can also change the background, which causes Mario to hum a song, like the underwater theme. The app has a lot of unique voice acting for Mario, which I assume is being done by Kevin Afghani here. Listen, he's doing a good job, but he is noticeably different from Martinet. It's impossible not to notice. Also, since this game is for little kids, there is sort of a timer. After 10 minutes, Mario will go to sleep, and you can't play with him anymore. You can just reset it by closing and opening the app, but it is interesting to see Nintendo embed some sort of parental control straight into the app. It is also amusing to see the Nintendo logo fade onto the screen as Mario leaves the frame to go to bed. Toddlers need to know the company logo. Now, if you're listening to this podcast, I'm going to assume you're either a teenager or an adult, and this game is not within those demographics. But it is fun to see new Mario art. He has expressions I've never seen from him, like an anxious face when the Cheep Cheep is near. If you are hardcore about 2D Mario art, this is like an interactive piece of official 2D Mario art. So I can see the value in that. But I think any toddler would have fun playing with it. And for parents, there's no ads, there's no AI-generated junk. It's just a simple, interactive, well-made piece of software that you can let your toddler play with for 10 minutes without worrying that their brain is rotting. But it may encourage them to violently stretch people's faces, so please be aware of that. Thus concludes my review of this game for 2-year-olds. So let's check out some news. Actually, quite a bit of news this time, so let's get to it. Let's start right here in Tokyo, as some new exhibits are on the horizon. Final Fantasy IX 25th Anniversary, the exhibition, will start on November 22nd on the 8th floor of the Yurakucho Marui department store. Not a lot of info about what will be on display, but hopefully we will get to see some documents from the game's development, for example. And of course, there will be the 25th Anniversary merch on sale that has been on sale for a few months now. Final Fantasy IX was heavily rumored to get a remake, but where is it? I mean, the year is almost over. Honestly, I think the game available on modern hardware is perfectly fine. That's the one I played, for example. You could do a faithful Super Mario RPG-esque remake, but again, do we need that? Square needs to be putting all their money into Xenogears or a Vagrant Story remake. I promise both of them will sell more than Final Fantasy IX. Please believe me. Also, Edit Mode is returning to Shibuya Parko via pop-up shop on September 12th. Edit Mode is the Kyoto apparel maker with a lot of awesome Nintendo collaborations. I've been to a few of their pop-up shops here in Tokyo and also covered them on the podcast, so go back and listen to that. And the big thing happening in Tokyo soon, Tokyo Game Show 2025. This is the first TGS after Switch 2's launch, so I do wonder how many demo stations will be showing off Switch 2 games. Nintendo is always a no-show for the public days, but Capcom is here in a big way, and they are showing off Onimusha, Resident Evil, Monster Hunter Stories 3, Resident Evil Requiem, and Pragmata. Other big games include Marvel Tokon Fighting Souls, Nioh 3, and also Hyrule Warriors Age of Imprisonment, so I'm hoping that also has a demo. Last year I couldn't go to TGS because my family was visiting, but I'll do my best and try to head over there this year. If I can't make it, well, I'll just snap somebody who did to come on the podcast. Definitely a lot easier than waiting in lines for hours and hours. Nintendo Museum also opened up an art gallery featuring never-before-seen artwork and other design documents from Nintendo's biggest franchises. Though apparently no Pokemon, so you're going to have to wait for the separate Pokemon Museum that I'm sure will open any day now. I think this new section definitely leans into more what people expected from the museum. People want to see things they've never seen before. We've all seen the Famicom box for Super Mario Bros. What I want most from the museum is definitely a limited exhibition area. That way they can get really granular and show off things they are probably not comfortable putting on permanent display. Hire Itoi to set it up. Give him any game and I'm sure he can figure out 10 different exhibits for it. Also, while I have covered the Nintendo Museum on this podcast, go listen to that episode, I actually haven't been to the museum just yet. They still do lottery applications for tickets, so I really got to pick a time where I can maybe go to Kyoto and then hope for the best. But if I ever do get to go in person, I will do a part 2 of the Nintendo Museum on the podcast. More Nintendo stuff. Warp Star Inc. is now Nintendo Stars. If you have no idea what Warp Star Inc. is, it was basically like the Pokemon company for Kirby, which mostly handled merch and other uses of the Kirby IP outside of games. Now it seems to have that same function, but it is expanding beyond Kirby. Not a whole lot of info about their plans or goals, but like with Nintendo Pictures, Nintendo is quickly trying to capitalize on their IPs in ways that go beyond video games. Films and TV shows are really the next frontier for Nintendo, and it's one of their most underutilized types of media. I think a lot of people are going to be comparing Switch 2 sales to Switch to determine whether or not Nintendo is making money, but these outside revenue streams are going to be key to Nintendo really raking in the profits. I can definitely see a report where they say, yeah, Switch 2 isn't pacing as well as Switch comparatively, but we are more profitable than ever thanks to our other revenue streams. And one of those streams will be Poke Park Kanto, coming to Yomiuri Land next spring. Junichi Masuda did an interview recently, and he confirmed that it will feature over 600 Pokemon, and they will also swap them out between the season and even evolve some of them. This is basically what I wanted. I want reasons to go more than one time, and for each time to be special in some way. He also noted that some Pokemon will be very hidden, and some will be so huge that you need to look up to them. I do wonder if they're just going to be porcelain statues, or will it be like Pokemon Wonder, where some are made out of different material. Either way, this is easily the thing I am most looking forward to in terms of gaming events. Keeping with Pokemon, there are new Mega Pokemon. Mega Victory Bell, which was revealed in some Resident Evil-esque video, and Mega Halucha. Mega Victory Bell, he looks dumb. Mega Halucha, he looks cool. And that's what you want. You need the balance between cool and dumb. I am liking how the Pokemon Company is handling these reveals, though. The horror style video was really well done, and the teaser for Mega Halucha with the boxing poster was a great piece of art. I definitely feel like the game's marketing has been a bit muted. I still don't know the gameplay loop and how the day and night sections will be balanced against each other, but drip-feeding new Mega Pokemon will keep people interested. The Mega mechanic is easily my favorite battle mechanic from Gen 6 and beyond, so I'm interested to see how they tie it into the new battle system. You can only summon one Mega Pokemon per battle, but with XY, a typical strategy is to have several that are capable of Mega evolving, and just using the one that fits the situation, so I imagine it will be the same in this new game. And we have some new NSO games, Forsaken on N64 in America and Magical Vacation for GBA in Japan. Forsaken is basically known for its unique advertising and box art featuring a woman with a heart tattoo. I mean, it is evocative, people decades later still remember it. But the actual game is just Descent. I have heard it's at least decent, a decent Descent. But for me, Magical Vacation is the big release. This is a Japan-only JRPG made by Brownie Brown, which was founded by ex-Mana devs. The devs also worked on Mother 3, more Mana games, and helped out with Level 5 games before becoming 1UP Studio, one of Nintendo's development support partners right here in Tokyo. They recently worked on Donkey Kong Bonanza. Ever heard of it? But Magical Vacation, it's one of those games that you see a screenshot of and you think, whoa, I gotta play this. It was one of the earlier GBA titles, so it really did show the capabilities of the hardware. The pixel art is absolutely incredible. Seriously, go look it up. It is kind of an infamous, this looks awesome, but it will never come to the West game, but the sequel, Magical Star Sign for DS, was localized. And again, NSO is really amazing because you never know what they're going to drop. We got Chibi Robo and Magical Vacation in a 2-week span. Do we need any other games? But if you want some, Nintendo Direct. It's happening this week, at least according to some. Obviously, there's almost always a Nintendo Direct before TGS, but this will be the first big boy Direct in a post-Switch 2 world. I think Nintendo's holiday is already locked in when it comes to games, but we do need dates for Prime 4 and Hyrule Warriors. People are wondering if there'll be anything for Mario's 40th anniversary, and I think there'll be at least something. I'm going to predict Donkey Kong Original Edition, just so I can gloat if I'm right. But obviously Nintendo will have some new games, maybe 2026 titles. I can see something from Intelligent Systems, who hasn't shown up at all this year. I'm also thinking Splatoon Raiders, Tomodachi Life, and Rhythm Heaven could be Q1 games for 2026, so they might get some love here as well. The last trailer at the end, what's it going to be? Let's just say Animal Crossing. I think if I just say it, it will be willed into existence, so let's go with that. Final note, this is episode 100, which I've said many times now, and I just want to say thank you to everyone listening. I really started this podcast because I felt like no other podcast perfectly touched on what I personally liked and found important in the gaming sphere. I mean, I ain't going for the algorithm here. I'm covering stuff I like. And shockingly, other people are interested in the topics I'm interested in. The fact that anyone at all listens to the podcast is incredibly humbling, and the podcast has kept growing, especially this year. So I really do appreciate people taking the time to engage with the show in any way. And also a special thank you to all the guests who have appeared on the show. The podcast wouldn't really be much without them. And if I can brag a bit, I do think I have the best guests. If I have no other skill, I am skilled at getting incredible people to share their knowledge and insight. As for the future of the show, I guess I'll keep going. I mean, it is fun to plan, to record, to edit. It is very cathartic in a lot of ways. I originally thought if I can keep my podcast going until Tears of the Kingdom, I will have considered it to be a success. So I guess the next goal is the next big 3D Zelda game, so let's all look forward to that. Hopefully before episode 200. And on that note, let's get out of here. Again, thanks as always for listening. Be sure to like and subscribe to this podcast on your favorite app. Leave a 5-star review as well, it really helps. The podcast is also available on YouTube, so like and subscribe there as well. I'm on Twitter, Threads, Blue Sky, Instagram, just search for Tokyo Game Life, or find the links in the podcast description. If you like the podcast, be sure to share it with your friends and on social media. The next episode will be on September 21st, episode 101. See you next time. Matane!